No hospital in Philadelphia would agree to take in the mother of mob boss Rocco Ferraro. For 3 years, Rosaria lay motionless on a bed on the second floor, a breathing tube fixed at her throat, an olive wood rosary resting in a palm that had long since stopped closing around it. 27 doctors had crossed the threshold of that room. Her son had used money, had used the name that made an entire city lower its voice, and in the end, had used begging. The answer was always the same. There is nothing more we can do for her. Then, one afternoon, a housekeeper who had been working there less than 2 weeks knelt down to wipe the foot of the bed, and her hand stopped. She saw something sitting quietly in that room, something so small, so ordinary, that for 3 whole years every adult in this house had walked past it 1,000 times, and not one of them had ever bothered to stop. She stood there with her hands still wet, and she understood something that nobody else under that roof had understood. But she had no idea that in the doorway behind her, Rocco Ferraro had been standing for who knows how long, silently watching her look at that one spot. And the next 3 seconds in that room changed everything. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you stayed with us all the way to the final lines. Share this story with someone you feel is waiting to be listened to. And don't forget to subscribe, so that every week we'll have another story to walk through together. 12 days before that afternoon, Maren Sullivan sat on a plastic bench at the bus stop on Girard Avenue, turned her wallet upside down over her palm, and counted her last coins. 4 quarters, 3 dimes, and a handful of tarnished pennies. She counted them a second time, more slowly, as though counting again might somehow produce a different number. It didn't. It was just enough for 2 bus rides home and a loaf of bread, and there would be nothing left for tomorrow. Beside her, Poppy sat perfectly still, her legs swinging a few inches above the ground, one hand clutching a tiny brass bell whose plating had long since worn away. The little girl was 6 years old. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken in 3 years. When Poppy needed her mother, she shook the bell. Once if she only wanted Maren to look at her, twice if something was wrong. Now she shook it once. Maren turned, and Poppy pointed toward the butter cookie behind the glass case at the convenience store across the street, then immediately drew her hand back and shook her head, as though she'd just asked for something she shouldn't have. 6 years old, and she already knew how to pull her hand back. Maren felt something rise and lodge in her throat. She gathered every coin into her palm, crossed the street, bought that cookie, and bought nothing for herself. Her phone vibrated just as she returned to the bench. The supervisor at the cleaning company spoke quickly, in the voice of someone reading from a sheet of paper, rather than talking to another human being. There was an opening in Chestnut Hill, a private residence. She would live in the house, eat there, and work 6 days a week. The pay was 3 times the usual rate. Maren was silent for 3 seconds. In this city, no cleaning job paid 3 times the normal wage without a reason. She asked why. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then the supervisor said that was the homeowner's only condition. No questions. No questions about anything, about anyone, or about any room. 4 people had been replaced in 18 months. She would be the 5th. And if she intended to ask questions, she would be better off turning down the job. Maren looked down at Poppy. The little girl was holding the cookie in both hands, taking the smallest bites, the way a child eats when she wants to make something last as long as possible. Inside Maren's coat pocket was an envelope that had been opened 3 times. A final notice stamped in red at one corner, with a deadline of the following Friday. There were 2 quarters left in her wallet, and there was one other thing she still carried. A plastic card she never took out, lying beneath the lining of her wallet like a pebble trapped inside a shoe, something her fingers brushed every time she opened the wallet in search of money. And every time they touched it, she remembered that she was no longer permitted to practice the profession that had once been her entire life. She raised the phone and said she'd take the job. The person on the other end asked whether she had a young child, then added that the homeowner would allow her to bring the child along, on the condition that the girl remain seated in one place, not run around, and make no noise. Maren said her daughter wouldn't make a sound. She said it in an ordinary voice, as though she were making a professional promise. And it wasn't until after she hung up that she realized how painful the truth she'd just spoken really was. The bus arrived. Maren lifted Poppy into her arms, fastened the buttons of her daughter's coat again, and before stepping onto the bus, she looked back at the street one last time, with the gaze of someone who knew she was crossing through a door that opened in only one direction. She didn't know who owned the house in Chestnut Hill. She didn't know why the 4 people before her had left. She knew only that she was running out of money, and over the past 3 years, she had learned one thing. People who had no money didn't have the right to ask questions. 6 days later, she stood before an iron gate, twice her height, holding Poppy's hand, and the gate opened without anyone ringing a bell, as though the house had seen her long before she ever saw it. The house stood at the end of a gravel drive that took about 5 minutes to walk, 3 stories high, with gray stone walls and every ground floor window hidden behind closed curtains in the middle of the day. Marin walked the entire length of that road with a canvas bag in one hand and Poppy's small hand in the other. And along the way, she counted 4 men standing at 4 different positions in the garden. None of them looked at her, yet not one of them took his eyes off her. The person who came to meet her at the side entrance was the housekeeper, an older woman dressed in black who spoke in clipped sentences, as though reciting a page she'd already read many times. She didn't ask Marin's name. She didn't ask how old she was or how long she'd been doing this kind of work. She only looked down at Poppy for exactly 1 second, then turned away and told Marin to follow her. They passed through a long, stone-floored corridor, and the housekeeper began speaking without looking back. There were 3 prohibitions in this house. The first was that she must never go up to the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor was Mr. Ferraro's private quarters, and there was no reason whatsoever for a cleaner to set foot there. The second was that she wasn't to enter the study in the east wing, even if the door was open, even if someone told her to go inside, unless Mr. Ferraro himself was standing there and called her by name. The housekeeper stopped at the foot of the stairs leading to the 2nd floor, and for the first time, turned to look directly into Marin's face. The 3rd rule, she said, was the most important of all. On the 2nd floor, at the end of the hallway, there was a room with an oak door that was always left slightly ajar. Mr. Ferraro's mother was inside that room. The elderly woman had been bedridden for 3 years. Marin would be allowed to enter once a day, at a designated time, to clean the floor, and only to clean the floor. She wasn't to touch the bed. She wasn't to touch the blankets or pillows. She wasn't to touch anything made of metal, plastic, or glass inside that room. She wasn't to draw the curtains, open the windows, or turn on any additional lights. She would clean the floor, leave, and close the door exactly as it had been when she entered. Marin nodded. The housekeeper didn't walk away immediately. She remained there for another moment, then repeated herself, more slowly than before, saying that Marin wasn't to touch anything in that room, that all 4 people who had come before her had heard those exact words, and that none of those 4 people were there anymore. Then she walked away, leaving Marin alone at the foot of the stairs with that warning suspended in the air like a thread pulled taut. They gave her a small room in the servants' quarters, with 1 narrow bed and a thin mattress laid on the floor for Poppy. No one asked why the little girl had come with her. No one asked why she didn't say hello. On her first day of work, Marin led Poppy down to the kitchen and seated her on a stool in the farthest corner, in the most hidden place, where the little girl could see her mother whenever Marin passed by. She knelt until they were eye to eye and told Poppy that she needed her to sit quietly there, not to go anywhere, and to shake the bell if she needed her mother. Poppy nodded. She sat there from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening. Not once did she climb down from the stool. She didn't touch a single thing on the kitchen table. In the middle of the afternoon, one of the kitchen workers passed by, stopped to stare at her for a long while, then turned to Marin and asked if something was wrong with the child, why she sat so still, and what kind of child could possibly remain that still. Marin was bent over, wringing out a cleaning cloth. She didn't look up. She only said that Poppy was a good girl, and the other person asked no more questions. Late that afternoon, when Marin passed through the kitchen for the 10th time, she heard one short ring of the bell. She turned. Poppy didn't need anything. The little girl only wanted to make certain that her mother was still inside the house. Marin smiled at her, and in that moment, she thought that perhaps she'd finally been lucky, that a job paying 3 times the usual wage, with 3 clearly stated prohibitions, was still far easier than the 3 years she'd just lived through. That was what she thought on the first evening. In the days ahead, she would find herself returning to that thought many times. The black car reached the gate after darkness had fully settled. It didn't sound its horn, yet the iron gate slid open on its own, and the 4 men in the garden turned their faces in the same direction at the same moment, then looked away at the same moment. Rocco Ferraro stepped onto the gravel, 33 years old, and the meeting at the docks had ended in a way he hadn't intended it to end. A ring of deep purple bruising circled his right wrist. The shirt he was wearing would never be washed. It would be burned, along with a name that, beginning tomorrow morning, no one in the Southern Harbor District would ever mention again. Gideon Pratt walked half a step behind him, still holding his phone, and said that the men on the other side wanted another meeting on Thursday. Rocco didn't answer. He kept walking, and Gideon didn't ask a second time. In the world these men inhabited, Everyone understood one simple truth. When Rocco Ferraro shouted, there was still a chance the situation could be saved. When he fell silent, it meant he'd already made his decision. He never said anything twice. He spoke once, and anyone who failed to listen the first time had only himself to blame. Instead of going straight into the house, he turned onto the path along the side, pushed open the glass door of the eastern greenhouse, and stepped inside. Only one plant remained there, a lemon tree growing in a large terracotta pot in the middle of the tiled floor. Its leaves were turning yellow from the bottom upward, their edges dry and curled, and not a single bud remained on any of its branches. His mother had planted it when he hadn't yet been as tall as the pot. Rocco stood looking at it for about a minute. He didn't touch it, water it, or cut away a single branch. He simply stood there, then turned and walked out, switching off the greenhouse lights behind him. The path to his private quarters took him past the kitchen door. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening, and the kitchen was almost empty. Only Marin remained, bent over as she wrung out the last cleaning cloth of the day, while in the farthest corner, perched on the stool, Poppy was still sitting in the same place she'd occupied since morning. Rocco walked past, then stopped. He stepped back half a pace and looked into that corner. The little girl looked at him too. She wasn't afraid. She didn't turn her face away, climb down from the stool, or search for her mother. She merely watched him with the eyes of a child accustomed to sitting quietly while adults came and went. In her hand was a small brass bell, whose plating had long since worn away, and she tightened her grip around it slightly. But she didn't shake it. Rocco stood there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds inside a house where everything was measured in seconds. Then he turned toward Marin, who had now straightened, her hands still wet, her heart beating so hard and fast that she could hear it pounding in her ears. He didn't ask who she was. He already knew. He knew everything and everyone who passed through the gates of his home. He spoke only one sentence, his voice neither raised nor lowered, without the faintest trace of menace, and that was precisely what made it so cold. "Keep the girl away from the 3rd floor," Marin said. "Yes, sir." Rocco didn't nod or say anything more. He continued on, and the sound of his footsteps receded along the stone corridor until it disappeared entirely. Marin remained motionless for a long while after he had gone from sight. Then she walked to the corner of the kitchen, knelt in front of her daughter, and Poppy reached out to touch her mother's cheek, the way she always did whenever she saw the color drain from Marin's face. That night, after mother and daughter had returned to the small room in the servants' quarters and Poppy had fallen asleep on the mattress on the floor, Marin sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness and thought about those 3 seconds. She had spent the past 3 years cleaning every kind of house, and she knew how wealthy people looked at the children of their servants. They gave them a passing glance, or they didn't look at them at all. The man she'd seen earlier hadn't merely glanced at Poppy. He had stopped, and Marin couldn't begin to understand why a man whose name made an entire city lower its voice should stop for 3 seconds before a silent child, sitting in the corner of his own kitchen. At 10 o'clock that night, Rocco Ferraro walked the length of the 2nd-floor hallway and stopped before the oak door at the far end. He stood there for a moment, before pushing it open, with the stillness of a man who needed a few seconds to change his face before entering a room. Inside, there was only a small lamp in one corner, and the steady sound of the ventilator, one breath drawn in, one breath pushed out, a rhythm that hadn't changed in 3 years. Rocco pulled the chair away from the wall and placed it beside the bed, sat down, then removed the watch from his wrist and set it on the table, careful not to let his mother see the dark ring of bruising beneath it, even though she hadn't opened her eyes once in 3 years. He sat in silence for a while, then began to tell her about his day. He said he'd gone down to the docks, that things hadn't gone as smoothly as he'd planned, that one man had been lying to him since April and he'd only discovered it that afternoon. He spoke in an ordinary voice, as though the two of them were still sitting together over dinner. He told her that Uncle Aurelio had stopped by the week before and brought a cake, still buying the kind with chestnut filling that no one in the family ate except her. He told her that the roof over the west wing was leaking again, that he'd already had it repaired twice and it still leaked, and that she'd told him long ago the whole section needed to be replaced because patching it was useless. She'd been right. She was always right. He stopped. In the silence, there was only the sound of the machine. One breath drawn in, one breath pushed out. He looked at his mother's face beneath the yellow light, at the wrinkles that had softened because she no longer frowned, no longer smiled, no longer did anything at all with that face, and he thought about an evening 3 years earlier when she'd called him to her and said there was something she needed to tell him, that it wasn't a small matter, and that she would tell him tomorrow. That tomorrow had never come. Rocco had never told anyone about it. He had never mentioned it to her again either. He had simply carried it everywhere for 3 years, like a stone in his coat pocket. And every night he sat there, he felt it grow a little heavier. He leaned forward, reached out to straighten the edge of the blanket, then looked down at his mother's left hand, resting palm upward upon it. The olive wood rosary had slipped from her palm and fallen to one side, its beads worn smooth from passing through her fingers countless times over countless years. Rocco picked it up. He arranged each loop neatly, placed it in the center of his mother's palm, then closed her fingers around it one by one, as gently as though he were afraid they might break. That hand didn't hold on. It never held on. Yet he did the same thing every night, 365 days a year, for 3 years, because she'd slept with that rosary in her hand ever since he was a child, and he refused to let the one thing of his mother that remained lie abandoned on top of the blanket. Before leaving the room, he rose and opened the drawer of the small table against the wall. There was a letter inside. The paper had yellowed along the edges and had been folded and unfolded so many times that the crease through the middle was nearly torn through. He didn't open it. He only looked at it lying motionless inside the drawer for several seconds, then pushed the drawer closed. He turned off the light. At the threshold, he looked back once more into the darkness where the bed stood and said softly, "Good night, Mother. I'll come back tomorrow." Then he closed the door, leaving it open by exactly the same narrow crack as always. For 3 years, he'd spoken those words more than 1,000 times and hadn't received an answer once. And as he walked along the hallway toward his own room, downstairs, in the small room in the servants' quarters, the woman who had arrived at this house only 2 days earlier lay awake in the darkness, with no idea that before long she would be the one to enter that room and see what this son, after sitting beside his mother's bed every night for 3 years, had never once been able to see. On the 4th day, Marin was assigned to clean the floor of the room at the end of the second-floor hallway at exactly 12:30 in the afternoon, while the private nurse went downstairs to the kitchen for lunch. She pushed open the oak door, carried her bucket of water inside, and did exactly as the housekeeper had instructed. She didn't look around. She didn't touch anything. She simply knelt and began to clean. The wooden floor was almost entirely free of dust. She had reached the foot of the bed when she heard a very faint sound behind her and turned around. Poppy was standing in the narrow opening of the door. The little girl had followed her mother upstairs from the kitchen without Marin noticing. Marin dropped the cloth, sprang to her feet, and took several steps toward her, intending to carry her outside at once, but Poppy reached the bedside before she did. The little girl gazed at the woman lying there for a long time, with the eyes of a child who wasn't afraid of sick people, because she'd grown accustomed to sitting quietly beside things she didn't understand. Then she reached out and placed her small hand on the elderly woman's left hand, which lay open upon the blanket, with the wooden rosary resting in its palm. Marin opened her mouth to call her daughter. She wasn't fast enough. That hand closed. Not quickly, not tightly. The fingers simply curled inward little by little and closed around the child's hand, held it for about 2 seconds, then let go. Marin stood frozen. She looked down at the 2 hands, one old and one young, then up at the elderly woman's face, which hadn't moved at all, then down again. Something rose inside her chest, something she'd spent 3 years trying to extinguish, and she had to draw a long, deep breath to force it back down. She lifted Poppy into her arms and left the room, her heart pounding violently, her hands still wet with water. She found the private nurse at the foot of the stairs, carrying a small tray upstairs. It was the first time Marin had looked closely at the woman. She was 41 years old and moved with quiet grace, and the first thing she did when she saw Marin and Poppy was stop, bend down until she was level with the child, and say, "Hello, Poppy. Have you been a good girl today?" She remembered the little girl's name. Marin had only been there 4 days, and still hadn't learned the names of everyone working in the kitchen, yet this woman already remembered her daughter's name. Marin said what she needed to say, using the simplest words she had, adding nothing and offering no explanation. She held my daughter's hand. The nurse looked up. Her smile didn't disappear. It only softened a little more, in the way a person's smile softens when she's about to tell someone something sad. She placed a hand on Marin's arm and told her not to dwell on it, that it had only been a reflex, that a patient's body sometimes contracted that way, and it didn't mean anything at all. Then she added, in the voice of someone sharing a confidence, that everyone who came into this house for the first time thought exactly as Marin did. The woman before her had thought the same, and so had the woman before that. And during her own first year, she'd run to tell Mr. Ferraro 3 times because of things just like this. She introduced herself. Her name was Colette Frawley. She'd been caring for Rosaria for 3 years, and if Marin had any questions, she should ask Colette and no one else in the house. Then she continued upstairs, the small tray in her hands, her feet moving lightly over the steps. That afternoon, Colette came down to the kitchen again, carrying a pot of coffee, and she poured a cup for every person there with her own hands, including the dishwasher, including Marin. She poured Marin's cup last, and said that the first 4 days were always the hardest, but by the second week, she would be used to everything. No one in the kitchen had a single unkind word to say about her. Marin held the cup of coffee and thanked her. She had meant to let what happened at noon slip away, and perhaps it truly would have, if she hadn't overheard a remark while clearing the table late that afternoon. One of the kitchen workers was stacking bowls inside a cabinet and speaking to the person beside her in a weary voice, as casually as though she were talking about the weather. Poor Mr. Ferraro. For 3 years, he's knocked on every door in this city, and even in several neighboring states, but not a single hospital will agree to take his mother. I can't understand why. The other person didn't answer. The conversation moved on to something else immediately afterward. Marin stood at the sink with her back turned, both hands still rinsing a cup beneath the water. She didn't turn around. She didn't ask a single question. But those words fell into some very deep place inside her, and lay there in silence, and she wouldn't remember them again until many days later, on the very day everything in that house began to break apart. From that day on, Marin began to watch. She hadn't meant to. On the bus ride, after accepting the job, she'd told herself that she would clean the floors, collect her wages, and never ask a single question, and for the first 4 days, she'd kept that promise. But the hand that had closed that afternoon had opened something inside her that she'd thought she'd locked away long ago. And now, every time she entered the room at the end of the hallway, her eyes moved ahead of her will. The first thing she noted was the timing. On the 5th day, she was cleaning in one corner of the room when she saw Rosaria's left foot twitch beneath the blanket. One very brief movement lasting only about a second, and then it stopped. She looked up at the clock on the wall. It was 10 minutes to 4. On the 6th day, she deliberately asked to clean the floor later in the afternoon, claiming that she needed to help in the kitchen at noon. At 5 minutes to 4, the elderly woman's right hand curled inward, then opened again. On the 7th day, it happened exactly at 4 o'clock, twice in succession, less than half a minute apart. By the 8th day, Marin no longer needed to look at the clock. She already knew. She stood there with the cleaning cloth in her hand and waited, and it came exactly when she expected it. Nothing in this world happened so precisely on schedule by accident. Illness didn't watch the clock. The second thing was the hand. On the 9th day, when Marin reached the foot of the bed, Rosaria's left hand slipped away from the rosary again and came to rest palm upward near the edge of the blanket, close to where Marin was kneeling. She didn't touch it. She only looked. Across every one of the elderly woman's fingernails were pale white horizontal lines. Not one line, but several parallel lines spaced at regular intervals, running across each nail like the rungs of a very small ladder. Marin knelt there for a long time. One voice inside her chest told her to stand up and leave the room immediately, while another voice, older and buried deeper, was counting those white lines and calculating how many weeks lay between each one. She stood. She left the room. But all that evening, as she folded towels in the kitchen, her hands kept stopping halfway through. The third thing came on the 10th day. Colette had washed Rosaria's hair that morning, and when Marin entered to clean the floor, the elderly woman's hair was still damp, combed back from her face and exposing the entire crown of her head. Her hair was thin, not thin in the way an elderly person's hair usually became thin, not receding gradually and evenly from the forehead, as it had with other old women Marin had seen throughout her life. It had fallen out in patches, and the scalp beneath was plainly visible, pale and uneven in color. On the shelf opposite the bed stood a framed photograph of the same woman, taken not long before, and in that photograph, she had a thick head of silver hair gathered neatly into a bun at the nape of her neck. Marin looked at the photograph, then at the head resting on the pillow, then back at the photograph. 3 years. A person could age tremendously during 3 years of lying motionless in bed. She knew that. She had seen it. But there were some things 3 years couldn't do. That night, Marin lay on the narrow bed in the small room in the servants' quarters, listening to the steady sound of Poppy breathing on the floor, and in her mind, she fitted those 3 things together the way someone might join 3 pieces of something far larger. Then she sat up, turned on the light, and whispered aloud to herself, very softly, "It's none of your business." She repeated the words until they sounded like an order instead of a plea. She took the envelope, stamped in red from her coat pocket, opened it, looked at the number on the final line, then folded it, and put it away. She looked down at Poppy, sleeping with one hand still wrapped around the brass bell beside her pillow. In this place, the little girl had a roof over her head, 3 meals a day, and a mattress thicker than the thin pad in their old rented room. In this place, Marin earned 3 times the usual wage. And if she could keep the job for 6 months, the number on the final line of that paper would disappear. She had already paid once for opening her mouth. She knew exactly how high the price was. She had paid with her entire life, and she had nothing left with which to pay a second time. She turned off the light and lay down, but in the darkness, her eyes remained open, and she could still see the parallel white lines across the fingernails of an elderly woman whose voice she'd never even heard. "What are you doing?" The voice came from behind Marin, neither loud nor harsh, merely a question placed in the middle of the room the way someone might set a heavy object on a table. She turned too quickly and nearly lost her balance. Rocco Ferraro was standing in the doorway, with one hand still resting on the oak door, and she had no idea how long he'd been there. For one brief second, everything inside her rose into her throat. She knew exactly what she had to say. She knew she needed only 7 words, and she knew what those 7 words would do to this room, to this house, and to the man standing before her. She opened her mouth. Then she swallowed everything back down. It went slowly, scraping her raw all the way, but it went down. She heard her own voice saying that she was sorry, that she'd cleaned the wrong place, and that she would leave immediately. Her voice sounded strangely ordinary, so ordinary that even she was surprised. The voice of someone who had spent 3 years learning to lie calmly whenever anyone asked what kind of work she'd done before. Rocco didn't respond. He didn't step into the room, and he didn't step away. He stood in the doorway and watched her, and that gaze was unlike any Marin had ever received in her life. It wasn't angry. It wasn't suspicious in the way someone might regard a thief. It was simply measuring her. She stood motionless beneath that gaze, both hands still wet, and counted every beat pounding in her ears. 1, 2, 3. Then he looked away from her and swept his eyes once around the room. The glance of a man who had seen this room thousands of times and no longer saw anything in it. His gaze paused for half a second on his mother's face against the pillow, and then he walked out. The sound of his footsteps receded along the stone hallway. Marin didn't move until it had disappeared completely. Then her knees weakened, and she had to brace one hand against the edge of the bed to keep from collapsing onto the floor. She snatched it back immediately, because the housekeeper had forbidden her to touch the bed. She stood in the middle of the room amid the steady sound of the machine. One breath drawn in, one breath pushed out, and allowed what she'd just seen to rise inside her again. The 3 things she'd noted over the past 10 days, the timing, the white lines, the hair, were all uncertain things. Things she could argue against in her own mind. Things a woman hired to clean floors might have misunderstood. What she'd just seen wasn't. There was nothing uncertain about it. It was right there. It had a shape. It had a size. It could be picked up and held. And in all her life, Marin had never encountered a circumstance, read a single line, or heard anyone say that it was permitted to be in a place like this. There were no exceptions. There were no special circumstances. There was no explanation in this world that could justify its having remained there for 3 years. She looked toward the bed. The woman lying there didn't move, couldn't breathe on her own, and didn't know that 2 people had just stood inside her room, and that one of them had seen what the other had never seen. Marin bent down, picked up the cleaning cloth, wrung it out, dropped it into the bucket, carried the bucket outside, and closed the door exactly as it had been when she entered, leaving it open by a narrow crack as the housekeeper had instructed. She walked the length of the 2nd-floor hallway. She descended the stairs. She reached the kitchen, set down the bucket, and stood with her back against the wall for a while. In the farthest corner, Poppy sat on the stool watching her mother, then rang the bell once. Marin turned and smiled at her daughter, a smile she had to pull upward with both corners of her mouth. That night, she lay awake until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. She could have spoken. That man had been standing 3 paces away from her. He had asked her a question. He had given her the exact moment that anyone in her position would have used, and she hadn't used it. She lay in the darkness with one hand resting on her chest and wondered what kind of person she was, that she could see something like that, then still walk out of the room and close the door behind her. But beneath the lining of the wallet on the table, less than 6.5 feet from where she lay, there was a plastic card with a hole punched through one corner, and that card knew exactly why she'd remained silent. At nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, Marin sat up. She reached for the wallet on the table, sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, and slipped 2 fingers beneath the lining at the bottom. She hadn't taken it out in 8 months. She didn't need to look to know where it was, any more than a person needed to look to know the location of a scar on her own back. She turned on the small lamp beside her and placed the card in front of her. It was made of hard plastic, dulled with age, bearing a photograph of a woman 24 years old, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, smiling and looking directly into the camera with the eyes of someone who believed she was standing at the beginning of a very long life. Beneath the photograph was her name. Beneath her name were 4 words, Emergency Intensive Care Unit, and in the upper right corner, a round hole had been punched cleanly and decisively through the card, the kind of hole someone punched through a ticket after it had been used. 3 years earlier, she had written a report. It was only 1 page long. In that report, she recorded that the wrong dosage of a medication had been dispensed to 3 patients during the same week. She listed the dates and times, and she signed her name at the bottom because she believed signing her name was what she was supposed to do. 3 weeks later, a patient died during a shift when she hadn't even been present, and when the records were opened, her name appeared in the exact box where it never should have been. She said she hadn't been there. She produced the duty roster. When that roster was retrieved from the system, it showed something different from the copy she held in her hand. They asked whether she had a witness. She had one. Her husband stood beside her. He made phone calls, knocked on every door, and spent weeks sitting in the hallways outside offices, demanding that someone review the case. He told her not to worry, that he would get to the truth. He said those words one evening in October. 3 weeks later, his car left the highway at 2 o'clock in the morning as he was returning from a meeting she hadn't even known he was attending. He was alone in the car. No other vehicle was involved. They called it a loss of control. 2 months later, this card was punched through and returned to her by mail inside an envelope without a single written word enclosed. Poppy was 3 years old then. She spoke in complete sentences. She sang, she called, Daddy, whenever she heard a key turning in the lock. After the funeral, she stopped. Not all at once in a single day. Her voice slowly faded over the course of several weeks. Fewer words, then fewer still, until she fell completely silent. People told Marin to wait, that Poppy would speak again. Marin had been waiting for 3 years. Sitting on the edge of the bed in that small room in the servants' quarters, she picked up the card and turned it beneath the lamplight. She thought about the room at the end of the second-floor hallway, about the thing lying silently inside it, and about the man who had stood in the doorway and asked her a question. She thought that if she spoke, a woman 71 years old might be saved. Then she thought about 3 weeks. 3 weeks was the distance between the moment she signed her name on a piece of paper and the moment she lost everything. 3 weeks was also the distance between her husband's promise and the telephone call at 4 o'clock in the morning. She had spoken once. She knew exactly what it had cost. And that price was sleeping on the mattress on the floor 5 feet away from her. A child 6 years old who couldn't speak, who no longer had a father, and who had no one left in the world except her mother. From the darkness near the floor came one soft ring of the brass bell. Poppy was still asleep, her hand wrapped around it, and the little girl had stirred in a dream. Marin looked down at her daughter for a long time. Then, she turned off the light, slipped the card beneath the lining of the wallet again, closed it, and returned it to its usual place on the table. She lay down, pulled the blanket over herself, and told herself that tomorrow she would clean the floor, collect her wages, and look at nothing. She believed that for about 4 hours, until the following morning, when she entered that room and her hands did something her mind had never given them permission to do. At 6:45 the following morning, Marin was already standing at the end of the second-floor hallway, exactly 15 minutes before Colette was due to arrive. She had spent the final hours of the night calculating how to do this, not with reason, because reason was still telling her to go downstairs to the kitchen and never return, but with something that lay beneath reason and refused to obey. She carried a bottle of distilled water taken from the supply room on the ground floor, something no one counted and no one noticed. She entered the room, closed the door behind her, and did it all in less than 2 minutes. She emptied the water chamber. She rinsed it. She filled it with distilled water, and the thing lying at the bottom of the chamber, something so small and so ordinary, she picked up, wrapped inside a paper napkin, folded into quarters, and slipped into her coat pocket. Then she carried the bottle downstairs to the kitchen and began her working day as she did every other day. At 3:50 that afternoon, Marin found an excuse to go upstairs with a stack of clean towels in her arms. She stood outside the narrow opening of the door and waited. At 5 minutes to 4, nothing happened. At exactly 4 o'clock, nothing happened. At 4:10, she was still standing there, the stack of towels damp beneath her sweating hands, and inside the room, Rosaria's left foot remained motionless beneath the blanket, still the entire time, completely still. Marin had to turn her face toward the wall for a while before she could go downstairs. On Monday morning, she did exactly the same thing again, and the second pill went into her coat pocket, wrapped in another paper napkin. That afternoon, when Colette entered the room at 5 o'clock, Marin was cleaning the hallway just outside and clearly heard the nurse stop in front of the machine beside the bed. There was the sound of a button being pressed, then another. Colette murmured to herself that it was strange and adjusted the support level downward, because the woman lying in the bed was drawing in more breath on her own than the machine needed to provide for her. Marin lowered her face toward the floor and continued cleaning. On Tuesday morning, the third pill went into her coat pocket. That afternoon, she went upstairs again with a stack of towels. But this time, she didn't have the chance to wait outside because Colette was already in the room, seated at the small table with the monitoring log open before her. Marin asked permission to come in and replace the towels. She was setting the stack down when she heard Colette say, in the same warm voice as always, that today was a good day, the first day this good in 3 years. And then the nurse bent down to write in the log. Marin looked toward the bed. Rosaria's left eyelid was moving. It didn't open. There was only a tiny movement beneath the thin skin, the movement of someone dreaming, or someone struggling to do something impossibly difficult. It happened again. Then once more, Marin heard the tip of Colette's pen stop against the page. She glanced over. The nurse was no longer writing. Her head remained bowed, the point of the pen still touching the paper, but her hand was motionless, and it stayed that way far longer than anyone would need to think of the next word. She sat like that for about 5 seconds. Then she raised her head, and the smile was still intact upon her face, but it reached her eyes and then retreated, and in that brief instant, Marin saw something she couldn't name, something that looked exactly like fear. Colette closed the log, rose, and walked to the machine beside the bed. She opened the lid of the water chamber. She bent down and looked inside. She said nothing. She closed the lid, turned toward Marin, and told her to leave the towels there and go downstairs, because she would finish cleaning the room herself that day. Her voice was still warm. She still addressed Marin with courtesy, but as Marin reached the door, she heard the lid of the water chamber opening once more behind her. The following morning, when Marin carried her bucket upstairs according to schedule, the oak door at the end of the hallway was completely closed. A new lock had been installed on it, its brass still gleaming, not yet dulled with age, fitted into a freshly carved section of wood, with sawdust still scattered across the carpet beneath it. The housekeeper approached from behind and told her that beginning that day, she no longer needed to come to the second floor. She was being permanently reassigned to the kitchen, and her wages would remain the same. Marin said, "Yes, ma'am." She carried her bucket downstairs, and in the pocket of the coat hanging from a hook in the small room in the servants' quarters, the 3 paper napkins folded into quarters remained exactly where she'd left them, 1 pill inside each. 3 days, 3 pills, something no one else in the world knew she possessed. That afternoon, while Marin was putting bowls away in a kitchen cabinet, Colette Frawley appeared in the doorway and asked whether she had a few minutes. She didn't speak there. She led Marin to the laundry room at the end of the corridor, where the machines were loud enough that no one in the hallway could hear them, and she closed the door behind them with a gesture so gentle that it looked as though she were merely keeping the warmth inside the room. She began by asking about Poppy. She said the little girl had more color in her cheeks than when she first arrived, probably because she was eating regular meals there, and she smiled as she spoke. Then she placed one hand on Marin's shoulder. The hand was warm and dry, and it remained there throughout the rest of the conversation. Colette said there was something she wanted to tell Marin in private, not because she meant to reproach her in any way, but simply so she would understand. Rosaria had been lying in that bed for 3 years. After 3 years of lying motionless, a person's body had almost no strength left with which to defend itself, almost none at all, and something tiny, a single bacterium that a healthy person could carry on her hands all day without harm, needed only to reach the right place in that room to end everything within 48 hours. She said this very slowly and very gently, like a mother explaining to her child why she mustn't touch a burning stove. Then she said she didn't blame Marin. Truly she didn't, because how could she? Marin hadn't been trained in such things. She was a cleaner. She had no obligation to know what other people spent years learning. From that moment on, she should simply leave that room to Colette, and everything would be best for everyone. Marin said yes. Colette nodded, her hand still resting on Marin's shoulder, then added one more thing in a voice even softer and warmer than before. She told Marin that she should also understand how generous Mr. Ferraro had been, No household on the west side of the city allowed a servant to bring a young child to live inside the house. Not one. Marin could ask anyone she pleased. He had agreed. And he'd agreed because Colette had spoken on her behalf. Colette paused for precisely 1 beat before finishing, and she ended by saying that she sincerely hoped Marin and her daughter would remain there for a long time. She truly did. She was very fond of the little girl. Then she removed her hand from Marin's shoulder, opened the laundry room door, and walked out. Marin lowered her head and said, "Thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." She heard herself speak, and her voice sounded exactly as it had 3 years earlier, when she'd sat in another room and apologized to people she'd never wronged. She remained in the laundry room for a while, surrounded by the sound of the machines, then stepped into the hallway. She took 4 steps, then she stopped abruptly. She stood in the middle of the hallway, with one hand still resting on the doorknob, and Colette's words returned to her, one word at a time. "You haven't been trained in such things." Trained. That wasn't how someone spoke to a cleaner. When speaking to a cleaner, people said that she didn't know, that she didn't understand, that she wasn't familiar with something. No one told a woman who scrubbed floors that she hadn't been trained, unless the person speaking already carried an image in her mind of someone else. Someone who should have been trained. Marin stood there and reviewed the entire 12 days she'd spent in that house. She had never told anyone there what kind of work she'd once done. She hadn't told the housekeeper. She hadn't told anyone in the kitchen. On the cleaning company's application form, she'd left the box for previous occupation blank. She remembered it clearly because she'd sat staring at that box for a long time before moving past it. Even her supervisor at the company didn't know. No one had known for 3 years. Yet the woman who'd just placed a hand on her shoulder, the woman who had remembered her daughter's name by the 4th day, the woman who poured coffee for everyone in the kitchen, had just used that exact word. Marin looked toward the stairs leading to the 2nd floor, where a new lock had just been installed on an oak door, and for the first time since walking through the iron gates of that house, she understood that they'd investigated her before she ever arrived, and that she wasn't standing outside this matter as she'd always believed. That same afternoon, another car passed through the gates, and the man who stepped out was in his 50s, with silver hair at his temples and a pastry box tied with paper twine in one hand. He didn't go directly into the house. He turned onto the side path, walked to the eastern greenhouse, and waited there. Bruno Calla came to meet him less than 2 minutes later. The 2 men stood beside the terracotta pot holding the lemon tree with yellow leaves curled at the edges, and they spoke for about 40 seconds. No one heard what they said. The gardener watering the beds on the other side didn't hear them. Neither did the 2 guards at the gate. They only saw Aurelio and Bruno standing inside the greenhouse like 2 acquaintances, exchanging a few trivial household matters, a scene they'd witnessed many times before. Bruno nodded once. Then he walked out, and Aurelio Ferraro picked up the pastry box from the wooden table, brushed off his sleeve, and entered the house through the front door. Rocco came all the way to the foyer to greet his uncle. He embraced the older man, and Aurelio patted his nephew twice on the back, the way someone might pat a child who had just done something well, even though that child now stood half a head taller than he did and controlled an entire harbor district. Aurelio handed the pastry box to a servant and instructed him to cut a slice, place it on a plate, and take it upstairs to his sister-in-law's room. It had to be taken up, no matter what. They could simply leave it there. He had once again bought the kind with chestnut filling. For 3 years, he'd continued buying that exact kind once a week, even though no one in the house ate it. Uncle and nephew went into the small dining room. Aurelio sat down, poured himself a glass of wine, and asked about the situation at the docks. Rocco gave him a brief account of the previous day's meeting. Aurelio listened, nodding thoughtfully, then told his nephew to leave it to him. He would go down there on Thursday. He'd known the temperament of the men on the other side since the days of Rocco's father. Rocco should stay home and take care of his mother. Rocco thanked his uncle. He said it quickly and with complete sincerity, because he had spoken those same words to this man more times than he could count over the past 3 years. 3 years earlier, when his father fell and his mother was confined to bed less than 6 months apart, Rocco Ferraro, then 30 years old, had sat inside the study for 4 straight days without stepping outside, and Aurelio was the man who went in and pulled him out of that chair. His uncle had taken control of the shipping route at the docks, the accounts, the meetings, and everything else a man couldn't possibly think about while his mother lay on the 2nd floor breathing through a machine. At the time, Aurelio had said one thing to Rocco: "You take care of your mother, leave the rest to me," and Rocco had. For 3 years, he went upstairs every night at 10 o'clock and sat beside that bed while his uncle took care of the harbor. No one in the house considered it unusual. It was family. It was how a true family functioned, when one of its own fell. Everyone in the house called him Uncle Aurelio, even the kitchen workers who had never spoken to him once. Before leaving, Aurelio rose, placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder, and said that Rocco looked thinner, that he needed to eat, because if his mother woke and saw him looking this way, she would scold Aurelio for it. Rocco smiled. It was the second time he'd smiled that day. He walked his uncle all the way to the car, stood watching until the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees, then returned inside. In the kitchen at the back of the house, Marin was slicing the cake and placing it on a plate, as instructed, the chestnut-filled cake that would be carried upstairs, left there, then brought back down untouched as it was every week, and she had no idea that the man who'd brought that box had stood in the greenhouse 40 seconds earlier and said something directly connected to the 3 pills hidden in her coat pocket. That night, Marin lay awake again, and as she did, a remark she'd heard many days earlier suddenly surfaced in her mind, like something that had lain submerged for a long time before rising on its own. Poor Mr. Ferraro. For 3 years, he's knocked on every door in this city, and even in several neighboring states, but not a single hospital will agree to take his mother. When she'd first heard those words, she'd let them pass. Now she couldn't. She lay in the darkness and thought, and what occurred to her made her sit upright. A man with that much money and that kind of name could buy an entire hospital department if he wished. Yet he'd spent 3 years knocking on doors and no one would admit his mother. It wasn't one hospital refusing. It wasn't 2. It was all of them. In 3 years of practicing her profession, and 3 more years of cleaning houses, Marin had never heard of anything like it. A hospital could tell a family, "We can't treat her." That happened every day. But refusing to admit someone was an entirely different matter. Refusing admission meant the patient wasn't even allowed through the door. On Saturday morning, her only day off each week, Marin left Poppy with a sitter who worked by the hour in the servants' quarters, walked down to the foot of the hill, and took a bus into the city center. She arranged to meet someone who had worked in the same department with her many years earlier, the only person among everyone she'd once known who still answered the phone when Marin's number appeared. They sat in a small coffee shop near the station. Marin explained nothing. She didn't say where she was working, or why she was asking. She merely offered a name and a year of birth, written on a scrap of paper torn from a shopping notebook, and asked the woman to look up one thing for her, whether the largest medical network in the region had an admission record under that name. The woman studied the paper for a long time, then looked at Marin and asked whether she was certain. Marin said she only needed to know whether the record existed. She didn't need anything else. The woman took the paper, folded it, said she would see what she could find, then stood and left. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, while Marin sat waiting at a bus stop on the avenue to return home, her phone vibrated. The woman spoke briefly, and her voice sounded entirely different from that morning. The record existed. It was in the internal system. It had never been deleted, and it carried a red flag. Marin asked what the red flag meant. The woman read the attached note, word for word, slowly, 1 word at a time. "Do not admit under any circumstances, pursuant to an executive directive." Marin sat motionless. She asked whether all 4 hospitals in the network shared the same system. The woman said yes, then added that the other 3 hospitals in the region didn't belong to the network. But when a record carried a flag like that, no one at those places would want to become involved either. Marin asked one final question. She asked for the date the flag had been placed. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the woman read out a day, a month, and a year. Marin heard the date, and for the first 2 seconds, it meant nothing. It was only a date. Then she remembered. She remembered because she'd heard that point in time mentioned over and over again in the house on the hill. The kitchen workers had mentioned it. The housekeeper had mentioned it. Colette had mentioned it. 3 years ago, from the day the elderly woman collapsed, from that night in that month. Marin counted backward in her mind. Then she counted again, more slowly, because she didn't trust the first calculation. The red flag had been placed on Rosaria Ferraro's record 4 days before the night she collapsed. 4 days before. Not afterward. Before. The phone slipped from Marin's hand and fell onto the concrete floor of the bus stop, its screen facing downward, the call still connected, and the woman's voice continued rising from it, asking, "Hello? Are you still there?" Marin sat on the stone bench, with both hands resting on her knees, and she could see clearly that they were trembling. A bus pulled in, opened its doors, waited, then closed them and drove away. She didn't get on. She remained there for a long time amid the traffic sounds of a Saturday afternoon, while everything inside her mind rearranged itself into an order she didn't want to see. Someone had known in advance. 4 days before that woman collapsed, someone had sat at a desk somewhere, opened her record, and closed every door before she ever reached it. Marin waited until Poppy was sound asleep. She took the 3 paper napkins, folded into quarters from her coat pocket, placed all 3 inside a small plastic box, normally used for holding buttons, closed the lid, then sat on the edge of the bed with the box in her palm until the clock reached 10 o'clock. She had considered folding their clothes, lifting her daughter into her arms, and walking through the iron gates that very night. She had thought it through carefully, even deciding which bus they would take the following morning. And she knew that if she did it, no one would come after her, because no one in that house considered her worth pursuing. Then she thought about the woman lying behind the oak door with the new brass lock still gleaming, and she thought about the hand that had closed around her daughter's hand, and she stood up. The hallway in the east wing was dark, with only one wall lamp burning at its center. Marin sat down on the stone floor across from the study door, leaned her back against the wall, held the plastic box between both hands, and waited. She waited for more than an hour. 2 men passed the far end of the hallway, saw her sitting there, and neither asked a question. Sometime after 11 o'clock, the main door in the foyer opened, and the familiar sound of footsteps entered the house. Rocco Ferraro stopped when he saw someone sitting on the floor outside his study. He stood there looking at her without speaking, waiting. Marin pressed her hands against the floor and rose. She stood slowly because both her legs had gone numb, and because something inside her was telling her to sit down again. She looked directly at the man before her, and she spoke. Her voice trembled from the first word, and she knew it was trembling. But she didn't stop once. She said that someone was putting something into his mother's airway. She said it happened every day. She said it had been happening for 3 years. She finished those 3 sentences and fell silent, and the only sound left in the hallway was the pendulum clock in the foyer below. Rocco said nothing. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He showed neither surprise nor anger. He simply looked down at her hands. Marin opened the box. Inside were 3 paper napkins folded into quarters, arranged beside one another. She took them out one at a time, unfolded each one in her palm, and held them out before him. 3 small white pills. One had almost entirely dissolved. One was half dissolved. One remained nearly whole. She said she'd removed them on 3 consecutive mornings, 1 pill each morning, and that every day she removed one, his mother improved. Rocco extended his hand. He didn't take the pills. He only held his palm beneath hers, and Marin tilted her hand and poured all 3 into his. He closed his fingers around them. He remained that way for a very long time, staring at his own closed fist, and throughout that silence, Marin didn't dare breathe too deeply. Then he raised his head and asked her exactly one question. "Why did you tell me instead of running away?" The question fell between them and lay there in silence. Marin didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the stone floor, then raised her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice no longer trembled. It had only grown quieter, so quiet that the man standing 2 paces away had to listen closely to hear it all. She said that 3 years earlier, she'd spoken up once. She said she'd signed her name on a piece of paper because she'd believed it was the right thing to do. She said that because of that paper, she'd lost her job, lost the profession she'd spent 4 years training for, lost her husband, and her daughter had lost her voice. She said that from that day until now, she'd remained silent. She'd become very good at remaining silent. She'd practiced silence until she had almost come to believe that she'd forgotten how to speak. Then she stopped. Then she spoke her final sentence. She said that if she remained silent this time, what she lost would no longer be her job. It would be the last part of herself she had left, and once that was gone, there would be nothing more she could afford to lose. The hallway fell still. Rocco Ferraro stood there with his fist closed around the 3 white pills, and the woman before him had no idea that in the past 3 years, not one person in that house, not one servant, not one guard, not one doctor who had crossed the threshold of that room, had ever spoken a single sentence to him without first calculating what it might bring them. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Rocco Ferraro unlocked the gleaming brass lock on the oak door with a key he'd taken from the housekeeper, without offering a word of explanation. He entered alone. He told Marin to remain in the hallway, and she stood there with her back against the wall, her hands gripping the sides of her coat. Inside, he didn't turn on the ceiling light. He pulled the table lamp closer, bent over the machine beside the bed, and removed the water chamber with both hands. The water swayed gently between his palms. He tilted the chamber beneath the light, and there it was at the bottom, a small white pill, still whole, newly placed there that evening, and not yet worn away at a single edge. Rocco poured the water into the porcelain basin on the table. He picked up the pill between his thumb and forefinger. It was so light that he could barely feel its weight. He had held every kind of thing a man in his world could hold. He had held things that forced other men to their knees, and now he was holding an object smaller than a shirt button. He turned his head toward the bed. His mother lay there with a breathing tube fitted at her throat, the machine continuing its steady rhythm, one breath drawn in, one breath pushed out. The chair where he sat each night stood less than 3 feet from the head of the bed. He had occupied that chair at 10 o'clock every night for 3 years. He had told her about the harbor, about the leaking roof over the West Wing, about the people who had lied to him, about everything. And throughout all those nights, within arm's reach of his elbow, this thing had lain silently at the bottom of the water chamber, doing its work. He had wiped her rosary clean. He had closed each of her fingers around it. He had wished her good night more than 1,000 times, and not once had he looked down. The hand holding the pill began to tremble. Rocco watched it trembling as though it belonged to someone else. He tightened his fingers to make it stop, but it didn't. He placed the pill on the table, braced both hands against the edge, lowered his head, and remained that way for a long time in the darkness, his shoulders raised, without making a sound. Then he straightened. He went to the door, summoned Gideon Pratt upstairs, and gave him 3 instructions in a voice that had returned to normal. First, go into the city immediately, find a pharmacy open all night, and buy exactly the kind of descaling tablets used in household humidifiers, round, white, this size, and bring back several boxes. Second, bring back 2 unopened containers of distilled water. Third, tell no one, including the housekeeper. At 2:45, Gideon returned. Rocco personally rinsed the water chamber twice, filled it with distilled water, and dropped one of the white tablets from the pharmacy into the bottom, an inert and completely harmless tablet, so identical to the other one that even he had to look twice. He fitted the water chamber back into its proper place. He closed the lid. He arranged everything on the table in the exact order in which he'd found it, then stood in the middle of the room for a while and examined the entire space through the eyes of someone who would enter at 7 o'clock that morning. Nothing was out of place by even a fraction of an inch. Beginning the next morning, that woman would still open the lid, still look inside, still see what she expected to see, and believe that everything was continuing exactly as it had for the past 3 years. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a car left through the rear gate. Dr. Warwick Ostrom, 64 years old and long retired, opened his door to Gideon Pratt in his pajamas and accepted a small plastic box containing 4 white pills. There was no paperwork accompanying it. There was no patient's name. Ostrom didn't ask a single question, because 40 years earlier, Rocco's father had done him a favor he'd never been able to repay, and because he'd lived long enough to understand that there were certain boxes brought to a man's door at 4 o'clock in the morning that he shouldn't ask about. 48 hours later, he came to the house. He sat in a chair inside the study, placed a sheet of paper on the desk, pushed it toward Rocco, and spoke. This is an industrial compound. It isn't permitted in any room where a patient is being treated. Rocco picked up the paper and read it. He read very slowly, from top to bottom, then set it down. Ostrom added that he'd reviewed the timeline Gideon had provided, and that if it had only been 3 years, the elderly woman's body still had a chance. Still, he repeated, placing emphasis on that word. Then he raised his eyes to Rocco and spoke his final sentence. But this can't be done in any hospital in this state. And I believe you understand that better than I do. During the next 4 days, everything in the house on the hill unfolded exactly as it had during the 4 days before. Colette Frawley still rose at 6 o'clock, still unlocked the oak door at 7, still opened the lid of the water chamber, still looked inside, and still closed it again with the expression of someone who had just confirmed that everything remained in its proper place. She still poured coffee for everyone in the kitchen. She still remembered Poppy's name. And throughout those 4 days, Gideon Pratt and 3 of his men traced her every step. The first thing they found was a telephone call. Once every month, always during the first week, always from the second phone she kept inside a desk drawer instead of carrying with her. She called a private treatment facility, about an hour and a half outside the city. Every call was brief, lasting less than 2 minutes. The second thing was money. For 3 years, a large sum had been transferred into an account in her name once every 3 months. But when Gideon's men followed the money, they discovered something strange. She didn't spend it. Not 1 cent. No house, no car, not a single trip. Almost immediately after entering her account, the entire amount was transferred to one place, that same treatment facility, in the form of prepaid medical expenses for a male patient 21 years old, whose last name was Frawley, her son. He had been admitted 3 years earlier. He hadn't been allowed to leave once. The third thing was a recording. Gideon's men obtained it from the second phone itself, a call made less than 2 weeks earlier, and they brought it to the study late one evening. Rocco sat behind the desk. Gideon placed the device on the wooden surface and pressed a button. A woman's voice came through the speaker, and she was crying, not loudly. It was the kind of crying that came from someone who had wept so many times that she no longer had enough breath to make a sound. She said she couldn't do it anymore. She said it had been 3 years, and she begged, she pleaded, to be allowed to stop. She said she would leave, that she wouldn't say a word to anyone if they would only let her boy come home. Then a man's voice answered. It didn't rise at all. It was calm, almost gentle. It said, "Colette, you've done very well. Just keep doing what you've been doing. Don't let yourself think too much." Then it added that the boy had been eating that week, so she shouldn't worry. Rocco Ferraro didn't move. He remained seated with both hands resting on the desk, and he listened until the end. When the recording stopped, not a sound remained in the study. Gideon Pratt stood beside him and didn't dare look directly into his employer's face, because he, too, had recognized that voice, a voice he'd heard hundreds of times inside that house, the voice of the man who had stood in the foyer only days earlier, embraced Rocco, and told him he was looking thinner. Rocco reached out and pressed the button to play the recording again from the beginning. He listened a second time, then he switched off the device. And in the silence that followed, everything from the past 3 years began rearranging itself inside his mind into a new order, an order in which every piece fit without a single one left over. His father fell. 6 months later, his mother called him to her and said there was something she needed to tell him, that it wasn't a small matter, and that she would tell him tomorrow. 4 days before that night, somewhere in an office in this city, someone opened her medical record and closed every hospital door before she could reach it. Then she collapsed. Then he shut himself inside the study for 4 days and refused to come out. Then someone walked in, pulled him out of this chair, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "You take care of your mother. Leave the rest to me." And Rocco had, for 3 years. For 3 years, he'd gone upstairs every night at 10 o'clock. For 3 years, he'd poured money into one doctor after another. For 3 years, he'd knocked on the doors of hospital after hospital, without understanding why every one of them remained closed. For 3 years, he'd believed he was fighting an illness with no name. He hadn't been fighting an illness at all. He had been kept occupied. They had never intended to take his mother's life, because when a mother died, her son buried her, mourned her, then rose and returned. They had kept her balanced on the exact line between life and consciousness, never allowing her to leave this world entirely, and never allowing her to speak a single word, so that every night at 10 o'clock, he would still have a chair in which to sit, so that he would remain still. Rocco Ferraro sat in the darkness of the study, and he didn't break a single thing. He merely grew cold, colder and colder, from the inside outward. And Gideon Pratt, who remained beside him for the next 10 minutes, suddenly realized that he would have preferred to hear his employer shouting. At 9 o'clock the following evening, Colette Frawley was summoned to the study. She entered with the expression of someone who still believed she was about to be asked about her patient's condition, the monitoring log still in her hand, and she even asked whether Mr. Ferraro wanted her to review the week's readings. Rocco told her to sit down. He didn't shout. He didn't rise. He merely pushed 2 things across the desk toward her. The first was a sheet of paper bearing several typed lines. The second was a photograph of a young man sitting on an iron bed in a room painted pale blue, his hair cut short, his body thin, his eyes turned toward the window. Colette looked at the paper first. Then she looked at the photograph. The monitoring log slipped from her hand and fell onto the carpet, and she didn't bend down to retrieve it. She remained upright in the chair for about 5 seconds, her face drained white, then her whole body folded forward, as though something had pulled out the frame holding her together. She confessed. She confessed everything without anyone needing to ask another question. And she did it in the manner of someone who had rehearsed the story inside her mind for thousands of nights, but had never had anyone to tell. 3 years earlier, they had come to her. Her son had been 18 at the time, suffering from a condition she couldn't afford to treat, and they offered to take care of everything, all expenses paid, at one of the finest facilities in the region. In return, she only had to accept a caregiving position in a house on the hill and perform one very small task each day that no one would ever see. She had said no. She said she'd continued saying no for 3 days. On the 4th day, they showed her the boy's discharge papers, already completed and lacking only 1 signature, and told her that if she refused the job, they would sign them and send him back to her that very afternoon, to care for on her own. She accepted. Then she raised her eyes to Rocco and offered the only thing she could say in her own defense. She said the dosage they had originally given her wasn't the dosage she'd been using. She said that if she'd followed their instructions exactly, Rosaria wouldn't have survived beyond the first winter. She had reduced it. She'd begun reducing it in the second month, and continued doing so for 3 years, bringing it down to the lowest level she dared, the threshold at which the people on the other side could look at Rosaria's condition and still see exactly what they wanted to see. She said that for 3 years, she hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night, that every night she sat alone in her room and calculated that number over and over again, because if she reduced the dosage too far, Rosaria would wake, and if Rosaria woke, she would speak a name, and the day she spoke that name would be the day they signed those discharge papers. She said she'd spent 3 years standing between 2 mothers and hadn't lived through a single good day. Then she collapsed over the desk and wept. Rocco Ferraro remained silent for a long time. He said nothing while she cried, and he didn't turn his face away. He looked directly at the woman folded over his desk, the woman who had entered his mother's room every day for 3 years, the woman who had remembered the cleaning woman's daughter's name by the 4th day. And he thought about another woman who, several nights earlier, had sat waiting for him on the hallway floor with a plastic box containing 3 pills in her hands. 2 women. The same thing to lose. One had remained silent for 3 years. The other hadn't. At last, he spoke, and his voice was so ordinary that Colette had to raise her head and look at him. He told her to wipe her face. He told her that tonight she would still go upstairs at the usual time, still do everything exactly as she'd done for 3 years, still open the lid, still look inside, still close it, and still write in the log exactly what she always wrote. He told her that his uncle would come by the following morning with a cake, as he did every week, and when the man asked how she was, Colette would smile at him exactly as she'd smiled for the past 3 years. In a broken voice, Colette asked what would happen to her son. Rocco looked at her and said that if she did exactly as instructed over the next few days, her son would come home. Then he added one final sentence, and it was the only moment that entire evening when his voice dropped lower. He told her she would never have to worry about his mother for another night, because the thing that had lain at the bottom of the water chamber hadn't been there for the past 4 nights. The first thing Rocco Ferraro did was get the child away. At about 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, a car left through the main gates, carrying Poppy and one of the older women from the household staff, toward a small house in the northwestern suburbs, more than an hour outside the city, where 2 of Gideon Pratt's men had been waiting since morning. Marin knelt before her daughter in the backyard and told her that her mother would only be gone for a few days, that she should stay there with the older woman, eat well, sleep well, and wait for her mother to come and get her. Poppy looked at Marin for a long time. Then she raised the brass bell and rang at once. One brief sound, the sound that for 3 years had meant she only wanted her mother to look at her. Marin held her daughter tightly, and after the car disappeared beyond the trees, she remained in the yard for a while before returning inside. From that moment until everything was over, the child remained more than 30 miles from the house on the hill, and nothing that was about to happen could reach her. At 4 o'clock in the morning, nearly every light in the house went dark. At the main gates, a black car started its engine, switched on its headlights, rolled onto the main road, then turned south, moving at an unhurried pace like a vehicle carrying someone out on business. Inside were only 2 of Gideon's men, and an empty bag. At that same moment, at the secondary gate behind the garden, a white ambulance without an emblem, an organization name, or an identifying number reversed toward the steps and turned off its lights. Rocco went upstairs alone. He disconnected the lines in the exact order Marin had recited to him twice during the night, transferred his mother to the portable unit waiting on a cart, then slid one arm beneath her back and the other beneath her knees and lifted her. She was far lighter than he'd imagined. He stood in the middle of the room for one moment with his mother in his arms, then carried her toward the door. Marin walked beside him, holding the portable unit with one hand, her eyes never leaving the numbers flashing across its small display. Before leaving the room, she turned back for the olive wood rosary resting on the blanket, and once the elderly woman had been placed on the stretcher inside the ambulance, Marin laid it in her left palm and closed her fingers around it. Rocco saw her do it. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered for longer than a moment. The ambulance traveled north. Rocco sat in the front passenger seat. Marin sat in the back beside the stretcher, and throughout the 2-hour journey, she never looked away from those numbers. The address of their destination hadn't been written on a single piece of paper inside the house on the hill. It wasn't stored in anyone's phone. Gideon recited it to the driver at 3:30 that morning. Only once. And until the wheels turned onto the dirt road, The driver was the only person in the vehicle who knew where they were going. Dr. Warwick Ostrom's clinic was a low 2-story building hidden behind a row of trees, without a sign, its rolling door lifting as the ambulance approached. Ostrom had been waiting there through the night, with 2 assistants he'd called back from retirement. He had the elderly woman taken into an inner room immediately. He worked for 3 straight hours without coming out. It was nearly noon when he finally stepped into the hallway, removed his gloves, and sat in the chair across from Rocco. He didn't use a single word to soften the truth. He said they would begin that very day, that the substance had been accumulating in her body for 3 years, and removing it wouldn't be a matter of weeks. He said 3 months. He said it might take longer than 3 months. He said there were certain readings he wanted to see improve within the first 40 days. And if they didn't move, he would have to speak to Rocco again using different words. Then he looked directly into the face of the man seated before him and said the sentence he'd been weighing since morning. He couldn't promise that she would ever wake. Rocco Ferraro nodded once. He didn't ask him to repeat it. He stood, walked to the end of the hallway, remained there with his back turned for about a minute, then returned and told Ostrom to ask for whatever he needed. People, money, equipment, anything, and that beginning that night, 4 of Rocco's men would remain at the clinic. At the other end of the hallway, Marin sat in a plastic chair outside the treatment room with both hands resting on her knees, and for the first time in 17 days, she didn't have to lie to anyone about anything. At that same moment, nearly 60 miles away in the house on the hill, a man picked up a telephone and dialed a number, and the call lasted only 14 seconds. The 14-second call had been made by Bruno Calla, and the man who answered on the other end was Aurelio Ferraro. Less than an hour later, the uncle's cars spread across the roads south of the city, and throughout that morning, they followed a black car carrying 2 men and an empty bag. They followed it all the way to the state line, until the car pulled into a gas station, and the 2 men inside stepped out to buy coffee, then stood there staring directly at the vehicles parked about 100 feet away. But Rocco Ferraro hadn't waited until then. He had begun before dawn. Bruno Calla was subdued in the middle of the backyard at the house on the hill just as he slipped the phone into his pocket, cleanly and without a sound reaching the kitchen. He was taken away. Within 2 hours, he had revealed everything he knew. From the night 3 years earlier on the road Rocco's father traveled for the last time, to the name of the man who had paid him every month, to the address of a small private airfield in the northeast that only a handful of people in the city knew existed. At 9 o'clock that morning, Gideon Pratt's men reached the airfield before the plane could be pulled from its hangar. Emmett Shaw, chairman of the largest healthcare network in the region, was stopped at the foot of the aircraft stairs with 2 suitcases and a leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was what people would later call the key to the entire case. It was a collection of printed and stamped internal records containing the order to place a red flag on the admission file under Rosaria Ferraro's name, signed by Emmett Shaw and dated 3 years earlier. Beneath it was an 11-page transportation contract between his healthcare network and a company registered in Aurelio Ferraro's name, effective from that same winter. He didn't manage to climb a single step. By afternoon, Aurelio was found at the warehouse by the docks, where he sat every Thursday to review the accounts. He didn't run. People said that when the warehouse door opened, he was still sitting on the only chair in the empty building, with both hands resting on his knees, as though he'd been waiting there since morning. Rocco entered alone. He stood about 4 paces from his uncle and said nothing for a long time. Aurelio was the first to speak. He said, "Son, sit down. Why are you standing?" Then he told him. He told him everything, not in the voice of a man pleading for mercy, but in the voice of someone finally allowed to speak about something he'd kept secret for 3 years, and who regretted that no one had ever appreciated just how brilliant it was. He spoke about the road his older brother traveled for the last time, and he said who had chosen that road. He said his sister-in-law had seen something she was never supposed to see, and he'd known it before she had the chance to tell anyone. Rocco asked why he hadn't simply finished her then. Aurelio looked at his nephew and smiled. The smile of an uncle teaching a lesson to a boy who wasn't yet old enough to understand it. He said that if she died, Rocco would bury her, mourn for 3 months, then rise and return, and that was when Aurelio would truly have something to fear. He said that a dead mother was only a grave, while a mother lying on the 2nd floor breathing through a machine was a chain, and a chain was far better. Then he spoke his final words, very slowly and very gently, in the same voice he always used while patting his nephew on the back in the foyer. "You've been such a good boy for the past 3 years, Rocco. Every night at 10 o'clock, you went upstairs. You sat beside her bed and told her stories. That was exactly where I wanted you to sit. Rocco Ferraro didn't lay a hand on him. He stood there, and for the next 30 seconds, not a sound moved through the entire warehouse. Then he said exactly one thing to his uncle. "You're going to live a very long time, and you're going to live in the same kind of room where you imprisoned my mother for 3 years. Then he turned, walked out, and the warehouse door closed behind him. That night, all the records, the recording, the account statements, the documents taken from the leather briefcase at the airfield, and Bruno Calla's testimony were delivered to the federal office in Philadelphia. Aurelio Ferraro and Emmett Shaw were turned over to federal authorities before dawn. Colette Frawley gave a 6-hour statement as a witness, and by the time she signed her name on the final page, the sky was growing light. That same night, 2 of Gideon Pratt's men drove for more than an hour and a half to the private treatment facility, presented a document bearing every required signature, and brought a young man 21 years old out of the pale blue room where he'd spent the past 3 years. The first 40 days passed very slowly. Dr. Ostrom had said he wanted to see the readings begin to move within that time, and during the first 3 weeks, they didn't move at all. Rocco Ferraro drove 2 hours to the clinic every day, without missing a single one. Even on the days he had to sit in the federal office from morning until evening, Marin remained there permanently. Poppy was brought back to stay with her mother in the small house 2 streets from the clinic, and every morning, the little girl walked with her mother to the entrance, then sat waiting in the hallway with the brass bell in her hand. On the 38th day, Ostrom called Rocco inside and showed him a column of numbers. It had fallen, not by much, but it had fallen. During the 6th week, they removed the breathing tube. Rosaria breathed on her own. For the first time in 3 years, the room where she lay held no sound from a machine, and for the first 2 nights, Marin kept waking with a start because of the silence. In the 8th week, the elderly woman began swallowing a few spoonfuls of food. In the 9th week, on a Tuesday afternoon at nearly 4 o'clock, Marin was wiping her hands beside the bed when Rosaria opened her eyes. It wasn't a blink. It wasn't a movement beneath the lids. She opened her eyes and kept them open, and she stared at the ceiling. Then her gaze slowly turned to the side, as slowly as a heavy door, until it came to rest on the face of the woman holding her hand. For the first few seconds, Marin didn't call anyone. She only sat there with Rosaria's hand still held inside her own and whispered, "Hello? You're awake." Then she ran into the hallway. Rocco arrived 40 minutes later. He entered the room, and his mother was looking toward the door. He stopped at the threshold. Then he walked forward, pulled over the chair, and sat in the exact position he'd occupied every evening for 3 years. Except this time, a pair of eyes looked back at him. For a long while, he couldn't speak. At last, he only said, "I'm here, Mother." Rosaria didn't answer. She couldn't speak yet, but she never looked away from him. And when he extended his hand, she lowered her gaze to it, then looked up at his face again, and something very small passed across the corner of her mouth. From the 9th week through the 14th came 5 long weeks. Rosaria remained awake longer each day, but her mouth still refused to obey her. Ostrom said they had to be patient. After 3 years of lying motionless, everything had to be learned again from the beginning. Marin worked with her little by little, twice every day, using the hands of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, even though all she wore then was a borrowed coat. In the 14th week, one morning, just after Rocco entered the room, and before he had time to sit down, Rosaria opened her mouth. She made one sound, then she tried again. On the 3rd attempt, it became a name. It was her husband's name. She called for the man who had lain beneath the earth for 3.5 years, clearly, as though she were calling to someone who had just walked out of the room. Rocco stood frozen in the middle of the room. Then she turned her head, looked directly at him, and spoke his name. Rocco Ferraro sank to his knees beside his mother's bed and didn't rise for a very long time, while Marin quietly walked outside and closed the door behind her, leaving them alone together. That afternoon, Rosaria lay resting with her left hand upon the blanket and the olive wood rosary in her palm. Rocco passed the bed and, out of habit, started to bend down and close his mother's fingers around it. He didn't have to. Those fingers had already closed on their own. They were holding it. He stood looking at that hand for a long time, then left the room without telling anyone what he'd just seen. In the 4th month, one afternoon, Rocco asked Marin to come into the small room at the end of the clinic hallway. There was an envelope on the table. He pushed it toward her and told her to open it. There was no money inside. It was a decision issued by a medical board of 7 members who had spent 6 weeks reviewing the entire record of a case from 3 years earlier, with all the original documents restored, including those Marin had never before been allowed to access. The decision was 4 pages long. On the final page, One line stated that every previous disciplinary finding against the subject had been vacated in full. Clipped to those 4 pages was a new card. The plastic was still firm, still carrying the scent of something newly made, without a single dulled corner. The photograph showed a woman 27 years old, with shadows beneath her eyes and her hair tied back in haste. Beneath her name were the 4 words she hadn't been permitted to carry for 3 years: Emergency Intensive Care Unit. And in the upper right corner, there was nothing. There was no hole. Marin held the card, thanked him, then walked straight to the clinic kitchen, closed the door, leaned against the sink, and wept. She wept for a very long time, the way someone wept after holding something inside for 3 years and finally being allowed to put it down. Throughout that time, no one knocked on the door, because outside in the hallway, a man stood blocking the way and motioned for everyone to take another route. Rosaria was brought home to the house on the hill at the beginning of April, seated in a wheelchair and holding the rosary in her own hand. The first thing she asked as they pushed her through the foyer wasn't about her room or about what had happened during those 3 years. She asked about the tree. Rocco pushed his mother's wheelchair out to the eastern greenhouse. The lemon tree was still there, its leaves yellow, its branches dry, standing in the terracotta pot like something people had forgotten to remove. Rosaria studied it for a while, then told her son that the soil was dead and had to be replaced, because watering it would do no good. That afternoon, Rocco Ferraro removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and dug up the lemon tree with his own hands. He shoveled away all the old soil, replaced it with fresh earth, cut off the dead branches, and continued working until darkness had fully settled, refusing to let anyone help him. His mother sat in her wheelchair at the greenhouse door and pointed out each place to him. Cut closer there, leave that bud, be gentle, son. In May, the tree blossomed. There weren't many flowers, only a little more than a dozen small white blossoms scattered across the new branches. But every morning, the delicate scent of lemon flowers drifted as far as the hallway, and people in the house began opening the greenhouse door to let in the air. Marin was no longer a cleaner in that house. She remained as the person responsible for all of Rosaria's care, with a private room on the 2nd floor, and the card she'd spent 3 years reclaiming pinned to her coat. Poppy had a small room beside her mother's. She no longer sat in a corner of the kitchen. She ran through the hallways, went out into the garden, and began spending nearly every afternoon in Rosaria's room, sitting on a low chair beside the bed and turning the pages of old picture books that Rosaria opened for her. The 2 of them, one 71 years old and learning to speak again, the other 6 and still unwilling to speak, sat together that way for hours every day without needing a single word. Then, on an afternoon near the end of May, when the sunlight had turned the color of honey and the bedroom window stood open, Rosaria reached out toward the little girl. Poppy looked at that hand. She placed her brass bell on the bedside table, set it down completely, and released it for the first time in 3 years. Then she took Rosaria's hand, and she called, "Grandma." It was only one word, hoarse, quiet, distorted from having gone unused for so long. But it was her own voice emerging from her own mouth, and she said it once more to make certain. Rocco Ferraro was standing in the doorway. It was the same place he'd stood one afternoon many months earlier, when he saw a cleaning woman with her back turned to him, staring silently into a corner of the room. That time, he'd walked away. This time, he didn't. He remained exactly where he was, and a moment later, Marin approached from the hallway, stopped beside him, and together they looked into the room without saying a word to each other. Over the course of 3 years, 27 doctors had crossed the threshold of that room, and not one of them had saved Rosaria. The person who saved her was a woman hired to scrub floors. Someone the entire world had decided no longer had anything worth hearing. The truth in ordinary life is rarely hidden somewhere far away. It lies directly before our eyes, in a familiar corner of a room we pass every day, waiting only for someone willing to bend down and look. The person willing to do that is seldom the most powerful one in the room. More often, it is the person who still possesses enough compassion to care about something that isn't her responsibility. So please don't be too quick to judge someone by the clothes they wear or the work they do, because sometimes the person capable of saving an entire family is the very person we have never truly noticed. If today's story has left something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that more meaningful stories can reach you every day. How do you feel about this story, about that woman, and about the choice she made? We would truly love to hear the honest feelings from deep within your heart in the comments below. May you and your family always be blessed with abundant health and a life filled with happiness and peace each day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.